So, as human beings, we have the power to either create or consume. And given the highly anticipated UFC 286 London card this weekend, you would think that there's going to be a lot of content out there regarding this particular card and this particular matter. Well, yes. So I decided I'm going to go out and create rather than consume what is out there and give my take on this matter, such as why is Leon Edwards not the type of fan favorite that he should be? In other words, if you've seen the first time that he won the UFC welterweight undisputed championship back in Salt Lake City during the summer of August, he came back to London and there wasn't really a lot of people at the airport. And you got to ask yourself, why is that? Why is it that somebody like Leon Edwards just did not get the type of reception that he was deserved when he came home after knocking out the pound-for-pound #1 guy in the world in terms of mixed martial arts? And people don't take that into consideration. I remember making videos comparing Kamaru Usman to Canelo Alvarez, saying to the effect that, you know what? Canelo Alvarez and Kamaru Usman are one and the same, which was appropriate of Kamaru Usman to want to call out Canelo Alvarez for a boxing match. However, appropriate with that was, of course, he had to do it in boxing because somebody like Canelo was not going to go in and do that in MMA. It's just not what he was built for. It's not what he trains for. And at his age, perhaps it may be, well, it's never too late if you're under 30, which is somewhere along the range of what Canelo is. But nonetheless, it's a harder transition for a boxer to go into MMA as opposed to an MMA fighter going into boxing, although some results are going to vary in that. And speaking of which, now there's rumors going around saying that Tyson Fury is not going to fight Usyk and that Deontay Wilder is going to fight Francis Ngannou, maybe in Africa. And more to come on that particular news because there's not a lot of confirmed reports on it yet, but one to keep out on. And also, let's keep in mind with some of the great fights that came from UFC 285, how about Ian Gary? Now, the one interesting thing that I found about Ian Gary's particular performance at UFC 285 was that he usually has a baseline of where he's very methodical, very, how do I say this? Like careful with the way that he fights, very conservative with the way that he throws his strikes, and also very technical in that matter. But in the later rounds, he was able to let off the rounds and throw a whole bunch of punches that was just not being able to be answered with, and it just looked like he was on a totally different level. I'm talking about Ian Gary. So another performance of the week was with Merab, just recently beating Peter Yan. Now, there's some controversy in that because the performance in of itself was controversial, but the decision-making of Merab really is making a lot of MMA fans angry at the fact that he didn't want to fight a teammate. And little do a lot of people know that this is a very common thing that has happened throughout the history of MMA, with fighters being in the same camp agreeing not to fight each other. For example, one of the first cases that I remember as a fan was with Josh Koscheck and John Fitch. They were trying to pit these guys to fight each other at some point, and they were some of the top 170 fighters in the UFC. Both got a title shot. Both were staying in the top 10 range, if they even had rankings in the UFC back in the days. And they were always trying to pit sparring partners against each other. Even Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz at some point were in that same category. Rashad Evans and John Jones, a very famous case of that. Rashad Evans, considered the captain of Greg Jackson's camp back in the days, and here's John Jones, just the prospect coming up trying to learn from the OGs of the game. Whereas with Rashad Evans was trying to big brother him, and then lo and behold, John Jones gets a shot at the title, the 205 undisputed championship against none other than Shogun Rua. And then what happens? He goes out, dominates, and goes on this 10-year run of light heavyweight supremacy, and now giving up the belt to the likes of Jamal Hill, Yuri Prochazka, and Glover Teixeira, and then Jan Blachowicz. These were the last UFC 205 champions after John Jones. And then here's John Jones, now the undisputed championship. Interestingly enough, when you go to the UFC video game, they usually have the roster, and they would have the guys on the top fighters list of each weight class, and you would often see the letter C on the champion. And I noticed that the C was not on John Jones. It was on Francis Ngannou. It was almost like this video game still follows the lineage of who the real heavyweight champion is. However, you can argue that, yes, John Jones is now the undisputed championship, but the lineal aspect of a championship is always going to be a controversial one. You even see it with Tyson Fury when he vacated his belts back in 2015, only for Anthony Joshua to start picking them up back in 2016, and so on and so forth. So during that time, in that era, you got to think that Anthony Joshua was trying to prove himself as the worthy champion. And this is the journey that John Jones now has to face right after UFC 285. And then how about the upset with Alexa Grasso being able to submit Valentina Shevchenko? So one of the greatest things about mixed martial arts is that there's always going to be a surprise for every sport. Right? There's always going to be a surprise for every matchup. And because of that, that's what makes the theater of the unknown a reality in mixed martial arts in the way that you describe it. You never know what's going to happen. And oftentimes you do think you know what's going to happen, because most Valentina Shevchenko fights, if you understand, were very dominant and you knew she was always going to win, which is why she was always taking co-main event spots. If you notice, she never truly headlined her own pay-per-view. And if she did, it wasn't a very big one and you wouldn't know about it. And even UFC historians like myself would not even find any type of data or remembrance offhand of her doing a top pay-per-view headline. Why? Because she was too dominant. And nobody wanted to watch, just like Mike Tyson back in the days. He was so dominant that a lot of people were willing to miss his fights. There were people that were barbecuing, and the next thing you know, they turned around, they were flipping a grill, and then boom, Mike Tyson knocks out Peter McNeely. That's the type of reality that some of these people bring, is this predictability of letting you know that, hey, you know what? I'm going to be able to finish this guy, and that's what you're always going to expect out of me. And then, lo and behold, Buster Douglas comes along. Holly Holmes comes along against Ronda. And now Alexa Grasso comes along against Valentina Shevchenko. But even before then, Valentina had to move up to fight the likes of Amanda Nunes, in which Amanda Nunes was able to expose her in that matter. But that's how the game goes, is the unpredictability. And speaking of unpredictability, how about this week, you're going to have a trilogy with Kamaru Usman taking on Leon Rocky Edwards live at the O2 Arena in London, England. And by the way, guys, shout outs to our new sponsors, Raw Financial. You see the symbol right there next to the Union Jack, up above the cage side, right next to the billing. Raw Financial for all your financial needs. Check out rawfinancial.co. Haha, the official sponsor for the conference call. But yeah, back to Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman. So as we know, in the first fight, it was almost similar to the second fight up until Leon Edwards was able to get the head kick knockout. And the significance of that is you got to ask yourself, is this same median or baseline that Kamaru Usman is able to provide, will that be something that he's going to be able to uphold in this upcoming fight? Meaning that, is he going to be able to get the takedowns? But you also have to wonder, Leon Edwards' takedown defense and even his own takedowns and trips are quite underrated. And not only quite underrated, very good, to the point where he was able to mount Usman in the first round of the second fight. And that's what makes this fight very interesting and very 50-50-ish. Now, the stakes that are on the line with this, the emotional stakes that is that you obviously seen Leon Edwards beat this Nigerian American champion in his own home country. And Salt Lake City, obviously very lackluster in the flamboyance or exuberance of a city, right? You know, you would expect something like Miami, as what you see with Piera taking on Adesanya coming up in April. You see a card like that. Of course, co-headline with Jorge Masvidal taking on Gilbert Burns. A city like that, New York, you had someone like Conor McGregor taking on Alvarez, and then, of course, Vegas, Abu Dhabi. But you don't think of Salt Lake City. Now they're going to go into London, one of the most famous arenas in the world, if not all of Europe, if not the greatest fighting arena of British mixed martial arts boxing history. They're going to do it right there, and imagine that's the home country of Leon Edwards and he loses. I mean, that's what makes this even interesting, because then you would think, are they going to have a number 4 fight? Just like what Manny Pacquiao and Marquez did, just like with Moreno and Figueroa did in their 4 fights that they were able to put together. You got to think, is this one of those fights? Because look at what's at stake, right? One guy beats another guy in their own hometown, but that's only if Kamaru Usman is able to get this win. And here's another interesting thing you got to think about with Kamaru Usman. If Kamaru Usman is not able to do this, you got to think to yourself, he is done on the championship levels. Obviously, he's still going to be able to beat the likes of Colby Covington, because he's just always going to have his number. He's always going to have the number of Gilbert Burns. He's demonstrated it. He's always going to beat Masvidal. There's just nothing left for him. And you got to think also that perhaps maybe this is the time of retirement. I don't know what it is. I feel a sense of retirement vibes coming from Kamaru Usman. I don't know what it is. But you got to understand, some of the reasons why I really believe that is because of the fact that Kamaru Usman has injured himself all throughout the years of his mixed martial arts and wrestling career. The guy has a bad back. The guy has bad knees. And then on top of that, the guy is not even able to truly go out for a run, which you got to think may limit him in his cardio, although one can argue that running is one of the most damaging things you can do to your knees long-term anyway. You look at the likes of David Goggins, by the way, shout-outs to him being in John Jones's, not corner, but I guess one of his honorary guests in the front row during his championship fight with Gane. But a guy like that who is a staunch runner, marathon guy maybe, Navy SEAL, special operator, you got to think a lot of these guys have bad knees, bad backs, or this and that. And yes, a lot of it maybe has something to do with, you know, the sack that you carry, or just the fact that you may run a lot, or a combination of both. But nonetheless, you're limited to the type of athlete you could be. But Kamaru Usman doesn't really seem to display any problems with his cardio. But then you got to think, maybe had he ran just a little bit more, maybe he was able to use his feet and move in a way where he could have offsetted Leon Edwards. And why do I say that? Because here's the thing. Kamaru Usman did a very good job taking him down, which was a beautiful thing that Kamaru Usman did in the first fight that they had back in December of 2015. Now here we are in the third fight of 2023. He was able to take him down, neutralize him, keep him there, school him on the wrestling, get on his full guard position, reign ground and pound, just like what any championship wrestler would do in the championship levels of MMA. That's what Kamaru Usman did, and the problem was, all he had to do was, if they're going to fight on the feet, and eventually if Leon Edwards was going to get up, you got to be able to gauge your distance away from him. He was too close within the kicking range, of which he could have prevented with maybe taking a step back or circling around him or getting away from his leg power side. You know, his you know what I mean. The part where where Leon Edwards kicked him, and he has to get away from that. He has to circle away from it. And he didn't really do that because maybe he was plotting a little bit because of the fact that he was tired and because of the fact that he felt that maybe there wasn't going to be enough gas, or maybe he felt that he already had it in the bank and maybe celebrated a little bit too early. But you got to think, Kamaru Usman feels limited. And that is the reason why I feel there's some retirement vibes going on, based on the fact that if he wins, okay, maybe he continues because this type of high you get, and then on top of that, the higher pay-per-view points you get after doing this one with whatever matchup that comes next. Maybe you'll do Hamzah at 170. Maybe you'll do a rematch with Colby. Highly unlikely, but then that is only dependent on if Colby goes out there and gets big wins, which Colby needs to even go out there and get fights first. Or maybe Belal Muhammad becomes the number one. Or maybe if Leon Edwards beats Kamaru Usman, then maybe they make Belal Muhammad the number one contender. But then you have Hamzah looming somewhere in there, and of course Hamzah's not going to fight or train, or rather just train during Ramadan but not have a fighting season or what have you, especially with Ramadan coming up in the coming days, which is the 14th right now, somewhere in March of 22. March 22nd, 2023, Ramadan. So now you have to think that this is the possibility of Usman's last hurrah. And then Leon Edwards may perhaps go out there and settle some scores with, let's say, the likes of Belal Muhammad, with the lackluster fight that they had going on with his eye getting poked and then having a no contest. And then the likes of Hamzah, which was made, by the way. Hamzah and Leon Edwards were supposed to fight, but never happened. And then a couple of times it fell through the way that it did, which almost became this generation's Tony Ferguson versus Khabib, as you've seen with the many times that they try to make that fight and never any of it happening for several reasons. One, Tony Ferguson falling off a wiring trip. And then the other times, of course, one guy getting an injury, and then Khabib not being able to make weight or passed out during his weight cut, or just a whole bunch of things that are related to injury. But again, that's the point of mixed martial arts, right? Here's an interesting thing about mixed martial arts in comparison to boxing. Of course, boxing is not an easy sport, but it's a lot easier on the body. And you can't deny that. Because of the fact that you're not wrestling and you're not using a lot of explosive movements all the time, boxing is just way easier on your body. But again, it's a combat sport, so it's never easy on your head. And of course, there's more deaths in boxing than there ever was in MMA. So make of that as you will, right? So combat sports in all its arts is dangerous for what they are. Like, for example, boxing, obviously, the head trauma injury that you're going to get in Muay Thai anyway, in MMA. But when you do wrestling, you're going to have back problems because you're constantly having to ram that thing and use it to impose your strength, impose your will. You're constantly gripping. So there's an aspect of joint issues that you're going to come across. And then, of course, there's always athletes out there that are always trying to figure out a way to prevent these things and then create longevity for their career. And, of course, the modern sports science that we have in these days sort of helps that. Sort of helps that, or makes that a much easier viable option. But nonetheless, you got to ask yourself, who is the most prepared guy going into this fight? I'm going to say Leon Edwards, perhaps. And the reason being is because he just doesn't have the same type of injuries alluring him the way that, let's say, Kamaru Usman has. And again, this is why I say there's a lot of retirement vibes going into this fight. Before we go into UFC 286, let's take a look at some of the fights that had happened in the past week. Obviously, we had John Jones submit Cyril Gane. He made it look so easy, made it look like he was an absolute amateur in that, right? Jeff Neal was able to put up a good fight, got the Fight of the Night awards, just wasn't enough. Shavkat Rakhmonov was able to rear naked choke him while standing up. Of course, Valentina and Alexa Grasso, as we mentioned, with a fourth round submission at 4 minutes and 34 seconds. And then Gamrot getting a decision over Jalen Turner. Bo Nickel just taking out Jamie Pickett so easily, but of course, with the controversy of perhaps doing a low blow, and Bo Nickel getting some stick with a lot of people saying that, like, you know what? A lot of people don't know what it's like to be in there. And a lot of people really took that to offense, right? Because what Bo Nickel is trying to convey in that message is that you guys don't understand what it's like to be in that cage, meaning that I'm supposed to go out and fight this dude until the referee tells me to stop. When you're in there, you're in combat mode, and there's nobody that's going to be the force of authority that's going to stop you if the referee isn't there. So it's the referee's job to, at their discretion, to understand whether there's a foul or whether there isn't. If the referee didn't see it, just like in pro wrestling, it doesn't matter. And moving on to the card, you had, of course, I mentioned Ian Gary with his amazing performance. Amazing performance against Keon Song. He really busted his face up in that fight. I mean, the absolute strikes that Ian Gary was able to put on, he threw 231 strikes, 127 of them landing, all insignificant strikes, by the way. 127 which showed in his face. There were no takedowns other than Keon Song. Of course, Ian Gary was able to get back up. And again, it's kind of one of those stereotypical things that you see with British boxing. British and Irish MMA fighters, is that they're traditionally strikers. They have a great Muay Thai program in Thailand and in England and in Ireland, and they're historically out there winning championships all throughout Asia, all throughout Australia, all throughout the Muay Thai circuits around the world. And the boxing side of it, I think, adds on to their striking. They're very great at their footwork. This is something that you see with Leon Edwards, something that you're going to see in the fight. And by the way, how about Jai Herbert fighting in the prelims on this one, right? He's had a loss in the prior one where Anthony Joshua and Eddie Hearn attended, and then got a win right after in the same other London UFC event, and now he's back in this one. Oh man, there's going to be a lot of good fights in that. So so back to Ian Gary. It was an amazing performance because obviously he looked lackluster in the beginning, and then he turned it up in the later rounds and was able to finish off Keon Song with just a couple of seconds left, right? He just decided, he's like, you know what, this guy doesn't have anything left. I've demoralized him, hit him in his face multiple times, busted his face up to the point where he wasn't able to see, to the point where he had looked like he was just, cut from the eye and just looked like he was blind. and he realized, I can finish this guy. So great on the awareness and the fight IQ of Ian Gary in that one. And then you had Mana Martinez taking on Cameron Simon. Cameron Simon getting a decision in that one. Cameron Simon getting the only takedown in the fight, which probably decided the entire thing. 146 total strikes, 117 of them significant. Whereas Mana just was able to get 63 strikes out of 160. Obviously, Cameron Simon was just way busier on the strikes in that one and won that fight. Tabitha Ritchie with a submission over Jessica Penne. Just was able to take her down a few times, 4 times in the entire fight. And then you realize that this girl was able to control her on the ground and neutralize her and just eventually finished her with a submission in the second round. And then Damon Blackshear taking on Fareed Basharat. Fareed Basharat getting a decision in that one. Esteban Ribovic versus Luik Radzhabov. Radzhabov with a decision. With Radzhabov getting 11 takedowns in this entire fight. It was just clear who was the dominant grappler in this particular fight. And Esteban coming in this fight undefeated, learning a lot from it. Obviously, just very young in his career, but we'll see what happens in that. And then moving on from this entire fight card, you had Jan and Merab. You had Alexander Volkov in the co-main event with a win over Alexander Romanov. Alexander Romanov is a prospect that was in the heavyweight division. We thought he was going to be the next Cain Velasquez or the Ukrainian Moldovan Cain Velasquez of some sort. And obviously he's fallen on tough times with these losses. But again, you never know in the heavyweight division, especially if you're very technical. This is something that I've seen with the likes of, let's say, Andrei Arlovsky. An interesting thing about Andrei Arlovsky was that the guy was able to get knocked out plenty of times in his career, but just jump right back in terms of being able to win fights, stay on top, or maybe get a few win streaks here and there. So it's not really over for Alexander Romanov. And in the type of fighting that he does, he's very technical with his wrestling, very conservative with his striking. So a guy in that kind of style, I think, is able to have longevity in his career, being able to not really try anything extravagant. Like, he's not this flashy taekwondo fighter, doesn't use a lot of explosiveness, which sometimes is susceptible to injuries if you don't know how to train them properly, of course, and then susceptible to constantly having to work your body in ways that I guess is not conducive to your long-term health or not conducive to your recovery. So with that, I think there's a possibility that he can possibly get right back up on the horse. And of course, one can't forget that with the experience that Alexander Volkov has, this is the reason why he's still staying on top. So this is also the reason why you can't count Romanov out in that regard. And then you had Nikita Krylov getting a submission win over Ryan Spann. You had Said Nurmagomedov losing against Jonathan Martinez, which many thought, including myself, that Said would have won this fight. He had 3 out of 9 takedowns. And out of the total strikes, he was able to land 101 out of 134 that he threw, whereas Jonathan Martinez just wasn't really that high volume in that regard, right? He had 78 out of 96, by the way, 81%. So perhaps maybe the percentage is what won him the fight. But nonetheless, 3 takedowns that Said got, and then none for Jonathan Martinez. He did attempt one, failed, but I guess the judges gave it to him for that reason, which, again, I don't agree with, but it's three judges that are out there, and they decide what's going on in the fight. It's what they see, but this doesn't count Saeed Nurmagomedov out by any stretch of the imagination, which is why, if you're a real fan and you look at records, you know that none of that really matters as in terms of what it is that that person is capable of doing. And what they're capable of doing can change and vary from fight to fight, and depending on what they do in between those training camps and how they lost prior. Again, with decisions like this, it doesn't really tell a lot about Saeed Nurmagomedov, but I would imagine that for his next opponents, it's going to be a much tougher fight for them. And I think Saeed is going to learn a lot from this, and he shouldn't hold his head down, because a lot of the hardcores out there really understood that Saeed had won this one. But nonetheless, well done for Jonathan Martinez. Mario Batista getting a submission win over Guido Canetti. Vitor Perino getting a decision over Anton Torkalov. And Rafael Assunção in this fight was his last one, and had lost to Davy Grant by this inverted triangle, which, by the way, was just one of those positions that comes very few times. When somebody sprawls on you in that position, sometimes you don't think about doing that. Maybe sometimes you think about going for, let's say, guillotines, or maybe try to take their back. But then when you really try and wrap your legs around them from that position, sometimes it's just one of those things that's just like comes once in a few times, in your life, or once in a few times in practice. And then it just presented itself. So well done on him on that regard. Josh Friend getting a submission over Dumas. Victor Henry getting a decision over Tony Gravely. Ariane Lipsky getting a decision over J.J. Aldridge. And of course, Aldridge attempted 12 takedowns, all stuffed, and 2 out of 2, Ariane Lipsky was able to keep her on the ground. 113 strikes out of 216. 56 out of 106 for J.J. Aldridge. They gave it to Ariane Lipsky, just more accurate. Bruno Silva getting a submission over Tyson Nam in the second round. Carlston Harris getting a decision over Jared Gordon in the first fight of the night. And now we move on to UFC 286. By the way, Justin Gaethje with Rafael Fiziev in this particular co-main event, I think, is really an awesome fight in terms of action-packed. Now, here's one of the things that I truly love about London. I think it's one of those hubs for action movie films, such as Top Boy. They had, what was that one? Bulletproof, with that Ashley guy that was also in Top Boy. They had Operation Fortune recently with Bugsy Malone and Hugh Grant, Jason Statham, Josh Hartnett, and all these other actors that are present in that movie. And then you had The Gentleman that had Matthew McConaughey, another Guy Ritchie film with another Bugsy Malone and Will Ferrell. So, and then also Snatch with Brad Pitt, if you guys remember that one. So all in turn, London and England in and of itself is really great for action movies, almost in the same way that Hong Kong was a hub for action movie films back in the 80s, the way that LA was and is back in the 90s and 2000s. This is what you're going to get for a co-main event in UFC London, is an action-packed type of fight, right? Because most of fighting, I got to tell you guys, is quite boring to the casual observer. There's a lot of technical aspects that you got to learn. There's a lot of intricacies that you got to try to understand. And there's going to be things that you may not know or understand in terms of technique, or why certain things seem stale when there's a strategic methodology being implied. And you're just not going to care. However, if you have these types of fights where you have the likes of, let's say, like Gotti Ward, all of Justin Gaethje's fights that he's had in the WSOF, the World Series of Fighting, which is now PFL. All these fights are entertaining and action-packed. This is what you're going to get out of these two guys, is an action movie. Meaning that if you've ever seen an action movie, you've seen how these guys are. What do? There's a lot of bravado going on. You see guys shoot. They're not even taking cover. They're just like, taking two guns, shooting it at the same time, really with no sense or rhyme or reason for anything other than just, macho machismo behavior, right? This is what you're going to get out of Justin Gaethje and Rafael Fiziev. Two guys that are strikers, right? Bangers at that. And then you have a 12-1 record for Rafael Fiziev. He seems to be one of those new crop of guys that are coming up in the 155 division. Just like you had Gamrot, you had Daniel Bariush, you have Armin Sarukian, who, by the way, had to take on Islam Makhachev on his first fight in UFC Moscow back in 2019. Who else do you have at 155 right now? Well, Paddy Pimblett, you can't really say is all the way up there because a lot of people look at him as a hype job, but at the same time, you got to think that maybe there's some validity to that hype or maybe not, based on the fact that he doesn't really take a serious step to being a professional outside of the cage, or maybe not. Maybe there's just an aspect of facade in that he trains a lot. Maybe he eats a lot, but maybe he maintains his skills by training, but not maybe maintaining his weight. But then you got to think, how does that affect his performance if he's not putting on the right amount of weight or taking off the right amount of weight? But then he just has this big backing from Barstool Sports. So you got to think that, okay, he's a hype job, but unproven. But nonetheless, there's a lot of big names that's coming up in the 155 division. And with that, you have the crops of staple that are gatekeepers at the top. Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira, Michael Chandler. I mean, considering that he was a Bellator champion and that he was a top staple at 155, of course, you always have Conor McGregor in there. And Nate Diaz can always come back and be in the mix. So these are the old guys that are in that old guard of top 155ers, not welterweights, lightweights. And Justin Gaethje is right at the top of that list. And this is what you have right here as a co-main event, is that you have the prospect and then you have the top star taking on each other. And usually when you have these situations going on, it never goes well for the top star or the top name. It always goes well for the prospect. And by the way, the UFC, in all honesty, is one of the best at doing that. They are the best at being able to take the prospect and somewhere down the line fight the top draw of the sport. You don't get that in boxing. And by the way, I'm segueing this right into Amir Khan getting attacked by the prospect fighter of Hamzah Sheeraz in some kind of restaurant, which is absolutely surreal. Because here's the thing. Amir Khan is retired right now from the sport, right? And with that retirement, he's not going to come back to fight the likes of Hamzah Sheeraz, who is in top shape, constantly training, getting all these fights, whereas Amir Khan is already rich, is just out of the picture, and then the size difference in and of itself is just not even a question. So you got to think, something like this usually ends in a fight, but not in boxing. You're not going to get that in boxing. And by the way, by the end of this video, I'm going to show you guys the video that happened with Amir Khan and Hamzah Sheeraz's dad. Hold on a second here. Here again, I'm going to show you guys right here again. Okay. There's an obvious conflict that's going on there, right? Here's the thing that you got to understand, though. This fight is never going to happen in boxing. It's just never going to happen. But with Justin Gaethje versus Fiziev, this is exactly what it is. Prospect versus legend. And they may not have beef, but guess what? It's always great to see that these top legends are giving these young guys a chance because, like I said, it's the old guards of the top 155 division taking on the new crops of the 155 division, and you're getting it as a co-main event. So I thought it was a nice little segue to get to that. And then you have Gunnar Nelson taking on Brian Barberena. You have Jennifer Maia taking on Casey O'Neill. Marvin Vittori taking on Roman Dolzev. I never know how to pronounce his name. Doledzi. Roman Doledzi. There it is, Roman Doledzi. So Marvin Vittori taking on Roman Doledzi. Jack Shore coming off of his first loss at 135, moving up at 145, taking on Makwan Amir Khan, the sparring partner of Conor McGregor in SBG Ireland. Chris Duncan at lightweight taking on Omar Morales. Sam Patterson at lightweight taking on Yanel Amazov. And Muhammad Makayev, 9-0, taking on Jafil Filo. Nathaniel Wood taking on LaRon Murphy, which is said to be canceled, but I believe LaRon Murphy is still in this card, which he is, taking on Gabriel Santos, 10-0. Two undefeated guys. Very interesting. Dusko Torovic taking on Christian Leroy Duncan. Jake Hadley taking on Malcolm Gordon, a former opponent of Makayev. Joanne Wood taking on Luana Carolina. Jay Herbert, the sparring partner of Leon Edwards, taking on Lued Klein. And then Juliana Miller taking on Veronica Machado, which, by the way, is the wife of Dan Hardy. Very interesting. So we got a real interesting card ahead of us because, once again, UFC London is back this weekend. And what an exciting fight card that we have in our hands, right? A lot of fights that I notice in this card, they are featuring a lot of the top local guys that they may have signed or guys that just may not have gotten their shine yet. And they're moving up Muhammad Makayev up in the ladder. As I've noticed in the past pay-per-views in the Abu Dhabis and in the London cards, he would usually start in the beginning of the card, like in the first fight, then it was the second fight, then it was the third fight. Now they're moving him up in the past early prelim bouts. Maybe I think he's not in the main card yet. But I would imagine after this fight, he's going to be in the main card. Now, I don't know much about Jafil Filo, this guy that he's fighting, which, again, they say in the UFC is that, there are no easy fights here. But you got to think these guys are not really known, but they're not easy by any means of the imagination, right? The only loss that Filo has had was a rear naked choke back in 2017 and then a decision against another undefeated fighter back in Brazil. So tailor-made for Muhammad Makayev, being that Muhammad Makayev is a submission specialist. The guy has had plenty of rounds in the amateurs, taken on the best in the world. So he's had not just amateur experience, but he's had world experience. A guy like that is going to be very dangerous for somebody like Jafil Filo, and already susceptible to submission in his career, I can't see why Muhammad Mokaev won't be able to submit this guy as well. So I see a later round submission for Muhammad Mokaev. I think he's going to cook him up a little bit. But in the later rounds, I think he's going to be able to get him. Especially with a submission. I think later in the second or third round, Muhammad Mokaev is going to get a decision. A submission in that one. And let's see what else is in this card. Gunnar Nelson against Brian Barberena. Yeah, Brian Barberena was one of those guys that bursted into the scene when he beat, what's his name? Mickey Gall. Mickey Gall was known for beating CM Punk. And what's great about that is the company was able to somehow create this promotion even under the top 15, which is what I think you need in order for a company to survive. Because if Patty somehow, in miraculous terms, makes it to top 10 or maybe top 5, one of the things you can count on is that his superstardom is going to burst even more. And he's already have this foundation with being in Barstool, having these sponsorship deals, being involved with Liverpool FC, having this mainstream appeal in England. That's what you need in those lower weight classes. So I hope that we can create some kind of promotion for these guys in the undercard of UFC 286. Gunnar Nelson and Barberena against Gunnar Nelson and Barberena. Jennifer Maia, Casey O'Neill, 9-0 Casey O'Neill, which is really interesting. At 9-0 in the main card of UFC London. Casey O'Neill, 25 years old, 5'5" at 125 pounds, 69-inch reach, in comparison to Jennifer Maia with a 64-inch reach, 5'3". So Casey O'Neill has a height advantage in this one. A Scottish-born Australian mixed martial artist, fights out of Las Vegas, trained with Tiger Muay Thai, trained with Extreme Couture, a brown belt in Jiu-Jitsu. Has wins over Roxanne Modafferi, split decision back in UFC 271 in Houston, Texas. Has beat the sister of the champ, Antonia Shevchenko, beat Shayna Dobson. Doesn't really have a lot of submissions in her career, but has finished 2 people in the UFC with TKO punches and got a submission win over Lara Propicio back in June of 2021. So who else is in this card? That's going to be a good one. Obviously, one of those fights where they basically feed the old in with the newer fighters, right? I mean, yeah, Jennifer Maia, 29 fights, 30 fights in her career. This is going to be her 31st fight in her entire career. Is coming off of a decision win over Merab. Has a decision loss against Manon. Has another decision loss prior to that against Caitlin. So very experienced, right? It goes into a decision a lot. Had a submission win over Joanne Calderwood back in August of 2020. That she got a performance of the night that night. So it's going to be a real test for Casey O'Neill in this one, right? Again, not a walkover. At first, I was like, you know what? Maybe it's one of these things where they have an undefeated fighter being fed to a veteran. But it's one of these situations also where the veteran can rise from the occasion and surprise everybody. Why? Because look at the experience that she has. She's been in there and had some rounds after rounds. Let me tell you, one of the things that you need as a fighter, especially early on in your career, is rounds. And maybe even after that, you still need rounds, but sometimes you don't get it because you get the finish. Well, what if you're Jennifer Maia? You're getting all these rounds and all this time, which can be very detrimental later on in the rounds. I don't know, man. I can see an upset in this one. I'm still going to go with Casey O'Neill, though. Younger, taller, more reach, undefeated. Seems like there's a reason why the UFC put her against her for that reason. Build a name off her, as always. But, again, it's the theater of the unknown. You never know, right? So that's the reality of that situation. With Gunnar Nelson, Barberena, I'm going to go with Gunnar Nelson in that one. Gunnar Nelson just seems to have the more disciplined striking. I think Gunnar Nelson is a lot more proven on the ground, although Barberena has some ground skills as well. I just think that Gunnar Nelson is just the better, well-rounded fighter and will probably get a decision just based on his strikes and being able to have the more disciplined approach, have the point karate game that he's going to play with him. And then you have Marvin Vettori taking on Roman Dolidze, 12-1 against 18-6 Marvin Vettori. Again, a big name against a prospect. The same theme that we've been going on about, right? Roman Dolidze, 34 years old though, but Marvin Vettori, the much more well-known name in that. 76-inch reach for Roman, 74 for Marvin Vettori. 34 years old, Roman, 29 years old, Marvin Vettori already fought for the championship. Very tough guy, but not as technical as a Roman Dolidze in that. What was his last fight? His last fight was against Jack Hermanson. Was able to knock him out with punches. So this is a very tough individual. I can see him finish Marvin Vettori just based on the fact that Marvin Vettori doesn't really fight as technical as he should be and can get caught. I can see Roman get a finish in this one somewhere in the later rounds. Maybe even a second round TKO of some sort. And then you have Chris Duncan taking on Omar Morales. Jack Shore against Makwan Amirkhani. You know what? I'm going to go with Jack Shore in this one. I think Makwan Amirkhani has a lot of miles under his belt, which is all right. But I think that Jack Shore has the right miles under his belt as being a former undefeated guy, but now moving from 135 to 145. I think that it's going to do him a lot of good with the speed. I just think that he's going to outpoint Makwan Amirkhani, and then they're great on the ground, but I think Jack Shore is just even better on the feet. I think both of their grappling is going to cancel each other out, which means you're going to see a lot of them take it on the feet, and I think Jack Shore is going to take that one. Chris Duncan, Omar Morales. I'm probably go with Chris Duncan in that one. Sam Patterson, Hamouche. I don't know. I have a feeling about this Yanal Hamouche guy, right? He doesn't even have a picture, but he's known as the Red Fox. 27 years old on a 6-fight win streak, undefeated at the moment. He is number 18 in the regional rankings of the U.S. Northeast, number 35 in the Middle East, right? Had a decision win back into PFL against Dennis Hughes, a TKO win against Ryan Rizko back in the CFFC, and the Ring of Combat win against Armando Getchi. So a lot of finishes, one decision. We don't really know much about this guy, but I have a good feeling about him. So I'm going to go with him in that regard. He's Israeli, this Yanal guy. But what about his opponent? Am I just going to count him out just because the other guy has a cooler name? Sam Patterson, 26-year-old, 6'2", 78-inch reach. Okay, maybe not. real tall guy here, right? Sam the Future Patterson fights out of England. 26 years old. Number 3 in the Middle East right now against lightweights. Okay, so he's had a win in the Dana White Contender Series. This is his UFC debut. He's had a win over Kunar Osmayev in Brave FC. Okay, so he's fought in Brave FC and Dana White Contender Series, and now he's fighting in UFC London this coming weekend. Okay. Maybe I'll go with Sam Patterson in this one by strikes. Seems to be a taller guy. I think he's going to utilize it. He's going to be able to out-jab him in that. So I'm going to go with him in this one. Chris Duncan against Eric Morales. So Chris Duncan, 29 years old, 5'8", 155 pounds, 71.5-inch reach. Where is this? Here we go. Chris, the Duncan Problem, 9-1, fighting out of Scotland. Okay, currently on a 2-fight win streak. Had a right cross ground strike. Interesting. Okay, had a decision win against Jonathan Carlos in UFL. His last loss was a left hook against Borechev. And that was back in Dana White's Contender Series. Okay, so he's another Dana White Contender Series guy getting another shot. And he's taken on who? Chris Duncan is taking on Omar Morales, 37 years old, 5'9", 155 pounds, 73-inch reach, 11-3 in his record at the moment. Fights out of Caracas, Venezuela. Okay. Let's see. And he is currently on a 2-fight losing streak. Okay. Has been knocked out and submitted in his last 2 fights against Jonathan Fears and Uso Medic. I think I'm going to go with Chris Duncan in this one. Probably a decision. Maybe these guys are going to come in there, fight a little bit more careful. I think this is Chris Duncan's first UFC fight. And yeah, Omar Morales has been in the UFC, but with 2 fights, lost twice. It's currently on a 2-fight losing streak. But with Chris Duncan, let's see here. Yeah, he's only been knocked out in the Dana White Contender Series. Okay, very interesting. I see this a decision for Chris Duncan in this one. Yeah, I have a feeling that they're going to fight a little bit more careful because now they're in a bigger stage. So they're going to be a little bit more reluctant to strike against each other. But I see Chris Duncan getting the better of the ground game against Omar Morales. But then I also see him knocking him down a few times. So what else? So Machado, which I believe is the wife of Dan Hardy. I'm going to tell you guys, I'm going with her over Juliana Miller. Why? Based on the fact that I just think Dan Hardy is a very good coach, and I think that he has a very good mind for mixed martial arts and fighting. And with that, I think that he's going to be able to utilize her with different scenarios in the game. I just think that he has a better preparation going into this fight. Of course, the record doesn't totally reflect that with Veronica Machado, almost like a 50-50 record with 6-4 and 1 draw against Juliana Miller, 4-1. Okay, a very tough task for Veronica Machado up ahead of her, right? Because, let's see, she's had a win over Bogan Walker back in August of 2022, and then lost to Claire Goodtree by decision, and that was really her only loss, right? Was just that decision loss. So Veronica Machado, on the other hand, Okay, has had a decision loss against Bia Malechki. He did beat and submitted Poliana Vienna. That was a good one. Was submitted by Jillian Robertson. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with Juliana Miller on this one. I think that, yes, Dan Hardy is a very good coach, but I just don't think that any coaching is going to help a fight against somebody that is that knows how to win and that has that momentum of doing so right now. So, but I don't know, stranger things have happened, but you never know. And then you have Jai Herbert taking on Ludwig Klein. Now, we've seen Jai Herbert fight a few times, right? How about Ludwig Klein from Slovakia? Okay, so he's coming off of a win against Mason Jones, by the way, former Cage Warriors champion, and then has a split decision against Devontae Smith. Has been submitted by Nate Landwehr, and then had a decision loss against Mike Trezano. You guys remember him, the little mullet. So that's the competition that he's had coming into this fight. Now, how about Jai Herbert, right? He's had his ups and downs in his career. He's currently training with the champ, 34 years old, 77-inch reach, 155 pounds, 6'1". The Black Country Banger Jai Herbert, former Cage Rage champion. Let's see, has had a decision win over Kyle Nelson back in UFC Fight Night in July of 22, rather, sorry. It was July 23rd, 2022. And then had that knockout against Ilya Tapora. Okay, but by the way, we've seen how good Ilya Tapora has been after that, and then had a win against Kamal Worthy before that, and then had a submission loss against Moicano, and then had a knockout loss against Trinaldo, but has had wins over Kane Karazua back in Cage Warriors. So he's had his up and down in the UFC and has had some championship wins in Cage Warriors. And here he is. He's taken on this guy that has had almost the same similar type of competition, right? Because let's look at the names that Klein has fought. Ludwig Klein. He's fought Mason Jones, Devontae Smith, Mike Trezano, Shane Young. Right, so these guys are moving up in the caliber of names that they're fighting. I'm going to see a decision win on this one for Jai Herbert. I just think that him training with the champ and then him having the reach advantage, he's going to be able to somehow manage to get these striking exchanges, especially in the jabs. And Leon Edwards is very good at doing that. I would imagine that they're training both in the same type of matter, and they're going to use that striking range and height to utilize the win that they need for a striking exchange. So I'm going to go with Jai Herbert in that one. I had already predicted Makayev. I think he's going to submit that guy later on in the second or third round, rather. Gunnar Nelson, I told you guys I was going to go with Gunnar Nelson in that one. Jack Shore against Makwan Amirkhani. I was going to go with, Nathaniel Wood was supposed to be in this card. How about LaRon Murphy against Gabriel Santos? So I know a little bit about LaRon Murphy because the first time I heard about him, they mentioned something to the effect that, this guy had been shot before, right? He's a Manchester guy who's been shot. And I was like thinking, wow, he has this 50 Cent-like story. And then on the day that Khabib fights Dustin Poirier, he ends up fighting, what's his name? Zubaira. So then when he ends up fighting Zubaira, they end up having a draw, which, by the way, was his only blemish in his record, if not a blemish at all. I think that those guys both deservingly deserve that draw, and I was just glad that let's just say that they got that draw because I like both guys and I didn't want any of those guys to win or lose. So it was one of those best decisions that you could get if you're a fan of either guy, right? So LaRon Murphy, he's taking on this guy who's not really known but is 10-0, has the same amount of experience that he does. Gabriel de Mosquito Santos, fighting out of Brazil, 10-0, Curitiba, Brazil. Okay, currently ranked number 8 in Brazil in terms of their regional rankings over there, right? He's had a win over Jose Delano, Marcelo Barbosa in the LFA, and then Elvis Silva in future MMA. So is undefeated, doesn't have any losses, right? Looks like a very top prospect that the UFC is bringing in, but somebody that isn't really known, right? You know, like I can't go out there and actually say that I've seen this guy fight because I just heard about him right now, right? And LaRon Murphy, I have seen the guy fight before, right? Obviously, I've seen him fight against Zubaira. He's had that fight. He's had that fight against Ricardo Ramos, Douglas Silva, DeAndre, and then he's had that flying knee with Makwan Amir Khan back in UFC 267, which was his last fight. So he's had some big names. He knows how to be in there with some big draws and guys that are fan favorites or guys that have a following behind them or guys that come from championship teams. Even though this kid, Santos, looks impressive, looks like he's primed to be a champion, looks like he's primed to be a UFC prospect, I just think that there's a high mismatch in terms of the experience level that these guys have. I'm going to go with LaRon Murphy by knockout in this one. So is there anything else? Are there any other fights in this card? Let's see. Nathaniel Wood was supposed to be in this card, but now he's not. Let's see here. I think that's about it in the early prelims. Oh, okay. No. There's more. Joanne Wood against Luna Carolina. Okay, so we've seen Joanne Wood fight before. Luna Carolina, 29 years old, fighting out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Currently has an 8-3 record out of his 11 fights. Has had a loss against Molly McCann. By the way, was the victim of that spinning knockout elbow viral shot of Molly McCann back in March 2022. And has a win over Lupita Godinez back in 21. Also had a win over Paulina Botello back in May of 2021, but a very close split decision. Has been submitted by Ariana Lipsky. Now taking on Joanne Calderwood, 37 years old, 5'5", 155 pounds, 65-inch reach against Luana's reach of 69-inch. Right now, currently 36 years old for Joanne Calderwood. Has a kickboxing experience of 19-2, so 21 kickboxing fights. Currently on a 3-fight losing streak against Lauren Murphy, Talia Santos, and Alexa Grasso. So what do I like about this fight is it seems that they're trying to give both of these ladies some kind of redemption. Obviously, Luana is coming off of that knockout where she was brutally humiliated by the likes of Molly McCann, right, in front of a London crowd, in front of her home crowd, in front of Molly McCann's crowd, rather. And now she's taken on somebody in Joanne Calderwood who is on a 3-fight losing streak. Both have been known for the English fighting fans for a while, obviously because Luana got that knockout as a victim of that. And Molly McCann as in the receiving end of that, not the receiving, the giving end of that exchange. And now here they are back in a crowd that is familiar with them. Obviously, Joanne Calderwood being Scottish, so she's known to the British, Irish, and UK fan base. and they're giving them a chance to redeem themselves against really a 50-50 fight in that. But how do I see this fight? I see this fight with Joanne Calderwood either getting a decision or a submission. Do I see her knocking her out like the way Molly McCann did? No. Because if you look at Joanne Calderwood's career, she hasn't had a knockout in a long time. I mean, obviously she's finished girls with submissions. She's had rear naked chokes. After rear naked chokes, had a triangle armbar. But mostly split decisions, even guillotine chokes as she's had. But she hasn't had a finish since 2016. Like a real legitimate finish in terms of knocking somebody out, which was against Valerie Letourneau back in 2016 in Ottawa, Ontario. That was with McDonald versus Thompson, by the way. So, very even 50-50 fight. But with Luana, she's susceptible to getting knocked out. And with Joanne Calderwood, she hasn't really been knocked out. So Luana has a real tough task in her hands in terms of trying to knock Joanne Calderwood out in this one. So I'm going to go with Joanne Calderwood by decision. Let's see. What else is in this fight right here? Yeah, I'm really excited for Justin Gaethje in that. You know, that is going to be a banger right there. Christian Leroy Duncan taking on Dusko Torovic for the middleweight division. So, what do we know about Christian Leroy Duncan? 27 years old, 6'2", doesn't have a reach being listed of any kind. But what do we know about this guy? He is former Cage Rage champion, okay, at 185. Okay, so this is going to be interesting. 7-0. British guy. Let's see here. Taking on Dusko next. Okay, that's going to be interesting. Okay, I see this guy getting a TKO finish against Dusko. Okay, I'm going to tell you why. Because there's not a lot that you can really take out of Leroy Duncan's game, right? But here's one thing that you can take out of Dusko's game. Let's see here. He's been knocked out by Chidi Nuji Kunai back in May 2022. He's been knocked out by Soriano back in January of 2021. And this guy, Leroy, has 7 knockouts as a former Cage Rage champion. I don't see this guy really lasting with him within the 3-round range. I see him finishing this guy in the first or second round. That's going to be my official prediction in that. So, real good for them to bring in Christian Leroy Duncan in this mix right here, taking on Dusko. And Christian Leroy Duncan, as you know, is a former Cage Rage champion. Middleweight, one of these new signees, and a top prospect that they're going to bring in. I think it's a great matchup. Again, there's no easy fights in the UFC, and the Cage Rage is one of those cards that, one of those fight promotions that are very, how do I say this? They're very top level. So I think they made a good matchup with this one, especially a good test for the first debut that Christian has going on. So let's see what else. What else is in this card? Very underrated cards that they have going on here. Very underrated. And then lastly, you have Jake Hadley taking on Malcolm Gordon, right? Let's see here. Hold on just a second. Let me look for something real quick. Hold on just 1 second. Let me pick up something. Okay, sorry about that. Had to adjust the mic just real quick. So, Jake Hadley taking on, who is this guy that he's taking on? Hold on just a second. Jake Hadley, hold on. Okay, here we go. Jake Hadley and Malcolm Gordon. Obviously, I had mentioned Malcolm Gordon is a former opponent of Muhammad Mokaev. That was his last fight, actually, back in UFC 280 in the Oliveira Makachev undercard. Was submitted in the third round. Obviously, he had to really work for that particular submission, right, Mokaev. You know, he had to kind of cook him a little bit to do that. But this Malcolm Gordon guy, man, he's got a lot of submission losses. I'm sorry, not submission losses. Yeah, he's had a few submission losses, mostly TKO losses, actually. He might be very chinny in this particular fight, right? Now, he's fighting this Jake Hadley kid, right? 9-1, okay? He's only had a decision loss. Has never been knocked out. And the majority of his wins, 22% of his wins come by knockout. He's had 2 wins by knockout. 56% of his wins comes by submission. He has 5 submissions out of his 10-fight career. But Malcolm Gordon gets knocked out a lot. So, once again, really brilliant matchmaking for the UFC in this one, right? You just have so much dynamics that you have going on with this one, because we know that Malcolm Gordon is susceptible to getting knocked out and getting finished. But this guy has only knocked out 2 people, but the majority of his wins are by submission. So we know that Jake Hadley knows how to submit people. But Malcolm Gordon is sort of that test of like, can I really knock this guy out, or could I submit him because he may be a little bit harder to submit and only the likes of Muhammad Mokaev and maybe some others could submit him. So this is kind of that test, but not really a dangerous test for Jake Hadley in Malcolm Gordon. So I'm going to go with Jake Hadley in this one, probably with a late stoppage of a third round. Now, the way that I see the way that they really cultivated this entire card was that they cultivated 50-50 matchups with possible finishes in the end. And that's just what I really see with a lot of these matchups that are going on with UFC 286. So, let me see here. What else? So, in the next coming episodes, I'm probably going to do an episode about Ramzan Kadyrov, which I think is really interesting, because let's really delve into this. Well, not right now, but later on when I do an actual episode of this guy. I think he's interesting because right now he's in the forefront of the Ukrainian war, right? And not only in the forefront of the Ukrainian war, he's also in the forefront of sponsoring top fighters both in boxing and MMA. As you know, he sponsors the likes of Arthur Beterbiev. Now he's an official sponsor of Hamzah Sheeraz. Even at some point, Khabib Nurmagomedov has been sponsored by him, and Islam Makhachev, so on and so forth. So all the guys that are in that region, Ramzan Kadyrov has some kind of hold in, and I think it would be really great to do some kind of story on that. I think there's some great content that you can make out of that, and also a lot of MMA-worthy news that can come out of it. So inshallah, that's something I'm going to do later down the road. And what else do we have for UFC 286 and 285? So, yeah, once again, John Jones has proved that he was one of the best heavyweights of all time, if not ever, if not one of the pound for pound greatest of all. The problem is now what is going to be disputed is the belts. Now, here's something that a lot of people have to understand. Yes, it is a fact that it's going to be disputed in the way that Tyson Fury had disputed all these other belts when he had left it in 2015, only for Anthony Joshua to pick up, and then only Deontay Wilder being one of the few guys that he didn't really get to fight yet, and still had his belt lingering around, but then later was able to get it, so he crowns himself as his lineage champion of some sort. Now, with UFC, you could say that about Francis, because even the UFC game is recognizing Francis as the official champion and not giving John the C yet. But then, for whatever reason, a lot of people are still going, like Dana White, are still going and saying something to the effect, well, you know what, John Jones would wipe the floor with Francis, only saying that in hindsight when he's not in the company. Notice how Dana White will say things like this if, let's say, you're not in the company, right? Or if you are in the company, he's not going to say it because obviously as a promoter and you're promoting both guys, you can't really be non-impartial to any degree. But then you bring out Conor McGregor to go box Floyd Mayweather, then of course you're going to be riding with him till the end. But nonetheless, that is what we have going on in combat sports today. That is what we have going on for UFC 286 this week. And that is what we had going on a few weeks ago with John Jones taking on Cyril Gane, solidifying himself as the top man of the UFC in the current moment, but still disputed with all these things lingering around. And then we had Merab taking on Peter Yan with a lot of issues that deal with, let's say, friendship and having to decide what is your next matchup going to be. Now, here's the thing that a lot of people have to understand, right? Is that nothing is definitive yet, because obviously Henry Cejudo still has to fight Aljamain Sterling. Now, after that, then we can talk. And then somewhere down the line, there's still Sean O'Malley, who has yet to get his title shot. He's already number one, and some say that he should go out and fight Chito Vera first, give him a shot at being the number one guy, or this and that. There's just all these matchups that still need to go on, but yet people want to push Merab and Yan to fight each other like John Jones and Rashad Evans back in the day. But that's the reality of combat sports, right? You know, combat sports is the theater of the unknown. You never know what you're going to get out of it, and you never know what's going to happen this weekend with UFC 286 live from London. And by the way, officially sponsored by rawfinancial.co. Enjoy the fights.